Illinois, 1600s to 1774, Part 2. Okay, the follow-up to the Marquette and Joliet explorations was that effort by LaSalle. And I do have an image of LaSalle for you. So he was a member of the French lower nobility and was out to make a name for himself and expand the French Empire in North America. LaSalle was able to persuade the governor and King Louis XIV to support development of the Illinois country. The goal was to gain control of the fur trade south of the Great Lakes. However, he had to furnish his own support, money from his family and friends. On one of these fundraising trips back to France, he met a fellow by the name of Henry de Tonty. And so Tonty is going to be extremely important as a co um, explorer on this expedition. Tonty had actually lost a hand in combat and had it replaced with an iron hook. This made him a rather interesting person to the Indians that he would meet later on. LaSalle had a tough time getting started. The ship that he had built, the Griffin, sank with a cargo of furs designed to help fund the development of the region. On his first trip into the area, LaSalle traveled down the Kankakee River to the Illinois River and built Fort Crevecoeur on the site of present-day Peoria. However, the men stationed at the fort mutinied after he left, and they destroyed the fort. He returned later, found that the fort was destroyed, and also Kaskaskia, the town nearby, that was also destroyed by the Iroquois, who had been encouraged to do so by the British. Nevertheless, in December of 1681, he and Tonty collected about 50 people, including Native Americans and family members, to set out for the mouth of the Mississippi. They reached the Gulf of Mexico early in April 1682, and in a ceremony, LaSalle claimed the Mississippi River and all the rivers that flowed into it and the surrounding land for France. Since he was including the Ohio and Missouri rivers, he was laying claim to almost half of the present-day lower 48 of the United States. LaSalle named this vast region Louisiana in honor of Louis XIV of France. LaSalle and Tonty built Fort St. Louis. On the way back north on the promontory known as Starved Rock above the Illinois River, and legend had it that that a band of these warriors starved to death while under siege by Potawatomi warriors. Sorry for pronouncing that word. Tonty remained at the site and defended against Iroquois attack, while LaSalle went back to France for more support. He was outfitted with 2 ships and 250 men. Unfortunately, by the time they had gotten to the Caribbean, the Spanish ship was able to capture one of those ships. The other lost its way in the Gulf of Mexico and ran aground in Texas. The expedition made an overland trek to the Mississippi Delta, and on the way, the soldiers rebelled and killed LaSalle. Now, by the 1690s, the fur trade in Illinois country served the interests of both the French and the Indians. Tonty remained in Illinois for a number of years and participated in the fur trade. He helped priests, government officials, settlers to mediate between Indian peoples for the next 15 or more years. He was asked by the church where to establish missions. They followed his suggestions and sent missionaries to a variety of Indian peoples, particularly those in present-day St. Louis. The village that they established was called Cahokia. That would actually be on the Illinois side of the Mississippi River, across from present-day St. Louis. In his last years, Tonty explored the lower Mississippi Valley and represented the French in negotiations with the indigenous Indian peoples. In 1704, though, he died of yellow fever in Mobile. And you can see Mobile down there towards the Gulf of Mexico. The French settlers established Kaskaskia in 1703, and the town would become, for the next century, the leading French settlement in Illinois and the commercial and cultural capital of the area. And I think that you can see Kaskaskia there. So there's Cahokia, St. Louis on the other side of the Mississippi River. And I have a couple of images. These are maps of Kaskaskia, the layout of the little town. So in the same region, they also created Fort Chart in 1720, which became the administrative center for the region. Also in that year, Philip Renault, overhead here. So Renault, he was French director of mines. He had come to the area hoping to find gold. Finding none, he began a lead mining operation. On his way to the Illinois country, he stopped at the island of Santo Domingo in the Caribbean and purchased 500 African slaves. A few years later, he left the Illinois country to prospect for metals in Missouri and northern Illinois, and Renault sold the slaves to French families in Kaskaskia, which begins slavery in what will become Illinois. The area being developed would be known as the American Bottom in the early 19th century. But this area during the French colonial period was basically a granary for French Louisiana. It was a large floodplain that possessed rich, fertile soil for crops necessary for French settlement. Lower Louisiana was unable to produce adequate food sources, so by the 1730s, the Illinois country became a vital food supply for New Orleans. Missionaries were encouraging settlements, and the fur trade was focused more regionally than on distant Montreal. Detroit was founded in 1701, and that was the closest French trading center north to trade furs. But because of the Mississippi, New Orleans became the primary commercial focus for the Illinois country. The French villages along the Mississippi River began to boom when New Orleans did. And from roughly 1720 to the outbreak of the French and Indian War, the Illinois country began to develop into an important, though remote, part of the French New World Empire. The French lived in compact villages with narrow streets lined with whitewashed one-story houses with wide verandas. Unlike the British and American frontier houses with notched horizontal logs, the French homes were built with upright timbers with horizontals only at the top and bottom of the space, with the top and the bottom of the walls of the buildings, and in between the spaces of the timbers were filled with clay, straw, or moss. The villages also had merchants who made up an upper class. Their dwellings were a little more upscale. These folks would have imported furniture, china, other luxury goods from Europe. The French tended to concentrate their population in the village and left to work their fields, to trade or trap, hunt, fish, etc. The village was a position of safety from hostile Indian attacks. The French colonial population was dominated by French Canadians. However, it was a heterogeneous population. The French had many mercenaries in their army who were Germans, Swiss, Italians, Spanish, Scots, Irish. It was very common for these men in the New World, when their term of service ended in the French military, that they tended to settle in the frontier. But there was a shortage of European women in colonial New France. And so there was considerable intermarriage between the colonial French population or heterogeneous population with local Indian women. This produced a Métis population. And also in these villages, you'd find African slaves as well as Native Americans. Traditional French farming in the New World revolved around long lots. And the system was a family farm in which you had a lot that was adjacent to a waterway. And so here's a map or an illustration that gives you an idea of what these long lots would look like. So there's the Mississippi River, and each of these lots were either individually owned or collectively owned and then farmed. Now, these strips of land had the advantage of providing a variety of land uses, soils, and that sort of thing. Also, plowing was easier because there were fewer turns to be made with oxen and plows, and the villagers also had a common for pasturage. The French traversed the waterways with boats of various sizes. Some were large enough to transport 30 tons of merchandise. Few were powered by sail. Most of these used oars or poles or ropes to go upstream in particular. This is how they would transport their product from the villages down to New Orleans, and then bring trade goods back up from New Orleans, which would be a much slower journey, and they'd have to basically push their way up the Mississippi using these long poles on the floor of the river. Oh, and this is population of Illinois country. So you can see it's not a whole lot of people. They have it broken down in terms of male, female, um, and then slave population, Native American slaves. Now, the British are going to take control of this area, but it's going to be brief and light. There's a lot of disagreement within the British administration over starting new settlements and occupying forts so far west of the seaboard colonies. But to get the British here, we first have to deal with the French and Indian War. So the French, the British, and the Spanish went to war off and on ever since they arrived in the New World. And the Illinois country was so isolated that it avoided any real direct participation in any of the 17th and 18th century conflicts until the 1750s. And conflict had been brewing with the British and the American colonists for some time, between the French and the British American colonists for some time, to the east, especially over the Ohio River Valley. That was, and then west of that led directly to the Illinois country. Put up that map again here. So you can see Fort Duquesne, and that would be at the beginning of the Ohio River, and then through that, heading west would lead you into the Illinois country. Now, this is the map before the war. So this you can see New France and its territory and disputed areas, and then the 13 colonies. So you can see the British and the French claims with the key there of the map. Now, for years, the British were trying to woo Indians toward their fur trade network, and Americans had been very hungry for land in the Ohio River Valley. And so for the French, they basically had to make a choice. What were they going to do? They had a very small population that wasn't growing very fast, but their only hope was really to establish some forts in the eastern portion of their inland empire and hopefully secure enough alliances with Native American peoples to kind of keep the British and the Americans from making their way west. One thing they really had going for them that the French had was that they did not put a lot of pressure for land. They were not like the Americans who wanted land or the British who wanted land as well. The French were more interested strictly in trade, and so that was one of the reasons why they had such a low population there and fairly good relations with native peoples. The British, though, had less expensive and greater diversity and in some respects better trade goods than the French. So they did have to definitely the Indians were definitely playing one empire off another to get the best trade goods. So essentially, the French were gambling that war with the British and American colonists would pay off in a victory that would protect their riverine empire. Nevertheless, the key to the French efforts were alliances and assistance with Native Americans. They could not win a conflict with the British without having those alliances. Now, the British initially experienced some serious military defeats early on in the war, but they basically had a war of attrition against the French, which slowly took its toll. They had a superior population in North America and also essential supplies. Also, the British strategy of cutting the American French off from France with the Royal Navy proved quite successful. So the French lost their ability to trade adequately with their Indian allies and thereby lost a lot of American Indian support. So with the Treaty of Paris of 1763, the French lost the Illinois country and all of their land holdings in North America. So this is the map now after the war. So the British have to occupy the Illinois country in an effort to calm the French and Indians down, because even though the French had lost the war, there's still a large population of French in the region, and there's also Indian allies, and they're fearful of American trappers and settlers heading west. So what King George III does, is establish the Proclamation Line of 1763. No settlements were to happen west of that line. And if you see that one line there, you can see that with a proclamation line of 1763. So American colonists were supposed to stay east of that line, allowing the French and the Indians to have peace and not have to deal with an onslaught of Americans and British heading into the west. The proclamation line, though, was ineffective. For one thing, some settlers were already living west of that line, west of the mountains. Others had been waiting for the war to end so they can move west. Land speculators and promoters who wanted to start new colonies, buy and sell land, set up businesses, were really key on making their way into that region. Ben Franklin and other colonial leaders went to England to argue the case for settling the western lands. For the most part, the proclamation line was simply ignored. Traders, trappers, pioneer settlers continued to head west, and there really wasn't much that could stop them. Part of the distress the native peoples were under propelled them into a pan-Indian uprising. And so this would be Pontiac's uprising. So along with war between the British and the French, there was this Pontiac. He was a powerful Ottawa chief who had been able to assemble a pan-Indian coalition, and he wanted his people to be free of European rule. Though in the war between the French and the British, he did side with the French, thinking they were a lesser of two evils. In early 1763, he amassed a coalition of Indian peoples and attacked a series of British forts in the interior. He had some limited success, but his siege at Fort Detroit failed. He was forced to surrender in Oswego, Illinois, in 1766. So after the surrender of Pontiac, the British realized they were going to have to commit troops and supplies to the interior and to Illinois in particular. In October of 1765, Captain Thomas Sterling and 100 British soldiers marched into Fort Chart. Sterling read a proclamation statement that the French settlers who wanted to stay and were willing to take an oath of allegiance to the British crown would be treated like any other English subjects. They would not be required to give up their language, religion, or traditions, and those not wanting to live under British rule were free to leave. Soon after the proclamation, the French commander and 20 or so soldiers crossed the Mississippi and took up residence in Spanish territory. The French settlers were torn between staying in their villages, trusting in British rule, cross into Spanish territory, or go back to France. Being Catholic, many didn't want to be ruled by a French king and didn't think that the British would live up to their promises. So about 1,000 French settlers in and around Kaskaskia moved west of the Mississippi or went back to France. About 2,000 stayed and hoped for the best. This exodus actually helped Missouri, St. Louis in particular, because so many people of talent went there to escape the British. The British soon realized that they had taken on a difficult task. Supplies were slow to reach the isolated fort. British soldiers and officers died from malaria in the summer and from the exposure in winter. There were no trained officials to establish a civil government, so when settlers complained, they had no reliable court or law enforcement on which to depend. Fort Chart was to have been a military and administrative headquarters for the British in Illinois, but within a few years it was in a state of decline. The Mississippi River also didn't help with its spring floods, though the British engineers did all they could to prevent it. In 1772, the English destroyed their fort so their enemies could not make use of it and moved to Kaskaskia. With the coming of the American Revolution, here. Oh, there we go. With the coming of the American Revolution, a way to kind of quiet some of the fears that folks living in the interior had, there was the Quebec Act of 1774. And so what this did is it basically established a semi-independent region, of which it also includes present-day Illinois and much of what was New France. This, of course, became part of the controversy that helped bring about the American Revolution.